Hi, my name is Skippen, and I'm back with another illustration breakdown. This time I drew my friend KUBO. She's an actress and model, and I'm going to link to her information down below. And this time I wanted to try to do something a little bit different and talk about the software that I used. Adobe just released Photoshop for iOS, and Photoshop is one of the apps that I've been using for a very long time on the desktop. It's my favorite app for doing semi-realistic paintings, and that's why I chose to use this as kind of a way to test Adobe's Photoshop for iOS. It's a pretty long anticipated app. Adobe had said that they would make a Photoshop for iOS, and in the past they had done stuff like Photoshop Express and other variations of things that you could edit photos or draw with, and they never quite matched the desktop software. It's been a little while since I did a illustration breakdown as well as a semi-realistic drawing, but it was nice to come back. It was a lot of fun. But it was also a little bit frustrating because this iOS app is very limited compared to the desktop software. If you're a big fan of drawing on iPads, you might recognize the UI as looking very similar to Adobe Fresco. And to me, it looks almost indistinguishable from Fresco. It feels very similar to Fresco, which is something that I'd used for a brief time. Thought that sketching on it was great for the most part, but never really did anything with it. And I feel like a lot of what I'm going to say here applies to Fresco as well, that iOS has become a very powerful platform for artists with apps like Clip Studio and Procreate being so featureful and customizable. And it just seems very strange to me that the industry leader Adobe doesn't let you customize these apps as much as Clip Studio and Procreate. They seem pretty powerful, and in some ways they're very fun to use, but there's a lack of like tool creation, tool customization, even customizing keyboard shortcuts, which is a big downer for me. I use this little hand controller that helps me with just a few different buttons like switch brushes, increase brush size, undo, redo. And because you can't edit the shortcuts on a keyboard, it just doesn't let me use that little device. I managed to do a little bit more work and a little bit faster with a keyboard, but I've been using Photoshop for over 10 years on the desktop, and the keyboard shortcuts on the iOS version of Photoshop are somewhat different, and especially in key places, and I just think that some of the language that has come about with iOS drawing apps, like pressing your one finger to hold to get an eyedropper, is just not there. I even had issues where I tried to rotate the screen, and this happened both on Fresco and at Photoshop, and it just did not rotate. So pinch to zoom worked, but not rotating. This is still very, very early impressions. I plan to do a full impressions or review video. Already started sketching out something more anime-like, and we'll see how that goes, but as far as the initial use, I can see certain features of it, I can see certain aspects that are very close to the software that I'm very familiar with. And I think that's why I was able to do my standard semi-realistic portrait in just about the same time as on the desktop. But it was more frustrating. Certain keyboard shortcuts didn't work, which adds to more time, and I didn't do it as well as I could have done, I'm sure, on the desktop. It just lacks some of the key features that I associate with Photoshop, even some filters and just different things to customize and warp and change the image to look the way that you want it to, that you don't always paint exactly the way that the finished image comes out. One thing that I've used pretty consistently with my portraits is not only blending layers, blending effects, but also to kind of warp the image at the very end. Maybe I didn't do the face exactly how I wanted it to, so either in Clip Studio Paint or Photoshop, there's different ways to adjust that, and it's something I do recommend for people that if you're doing like a one-layer paint or just a semi-realistic portrait like I do, you don't have that many layers, you're stacking them, and then at the end you're probably merging them. Maybe one eye is slightly shifted from where you originally wanted to. When you have the sketch, it looked fine, but as you refine it, you realize it's slightly off, and the tools are just not there in this iteration of Photoshop for iOS. And it is kind of a strange thing because Photoshop is originally something to manipulate photos, and in manipulating photos, you might want to move an eye around or something. These things can be fixed to a certain extent with software updates, but with the UI as it is, I don't think that it will get that much closer to the desktop software. That being said, being able to take some of my favorite brushes, like the classic Photoshop round brush and all that, out wherever I want to paint with is pretty cool. And with Adobe's cloud or whatever it is, it's very easy to draw on multiple devices, so if you just want to take it out to sketch or start on a project and finish it at home, that's perfectly possible. One thing that is really frustrating is that I could not find a way to edit the pressure curve, and for me personally it was just a little bit too much pressure that needed to be applied to paint in this way. So it did kind of start to hurt my wrist a bit, and I would like more features like that. Even Fresco has just a slider, which is basic but better than nothing. But in the end it was a lot of fun to paint this piece. I always enjoy drawing KUBO. If you're looking for reference pictures, or if you want to do a similar style portrait, she's a great place to look for photos. There's always interesting poses and lighting and clothing and all, so that's always helpful for artists looking to practice. And there were brief moments where it felt like I was using Photoshop on the desktop, but it just kind of drags me out whenever I found something that was in my way blocking it. The way that I tend to draw is I'll copy the color that I just laid down. Maybe I'll have my brush at a 70% opacity. I'll do 1 or 2 strokes, and then I'll copy that color and paint above that, and then above that, and to create this little gradient that is a little bit more painterly than maybe just using a marquee tool and putting a gradient with the gradient tool. I think it adds more depth, showing a play between highlights and shadows. But this was a little bit more difficult to do with the iOS version of Photoshop. It's not the same way that I would typically select the color in the desktop version, or even Clip Studio, other software that I use. So it just takes more time each time I go to select a color, and that just becomes more frustrating. And even tools seem to reset back to their original settings, which just wastes a little bit of time here and there, but it really adds up. Painting in a semi-realistic style, you really need to have full control over your tools. It's a basic way of painting, and I don't use too many brushes, but I really want to have access to all these little functions that help me paint faster. Like I said, this is still very early impressions. Let me know if you found any workarounds, or if I said something that wasn't correct about the software. I really hope that Photoshop for the iOS ends up working out. I hope I can find a way to use it, or that the software gets updated to a point where it's very easy to use, friendly to use, and has more advanced features. I think in many ways that artists should use the tools that they're comfortable with. They shouldn't bend to use certain tools just because it's what's popular or it's what's new. But I'm going to continue trying out Photoshop for iOS and release a more concrete impressions video, or just a full review in the coming weeks, so please get subscribed to be able to watch that. If you have any questions or other tips for Photoshop, please leave a comment. I'd love to talk about art, Photoshop, iPads, anything like that. I'm Skipen. You can find me on Instagram at Skipen, and on DeviantArt, TSKPN.